At the heart of the Tuesday afternoon, Ladies' Fellowship was a long table adorned with floral linen, laden with Victoria sponge cucumber sandwiches and warm scones. The spring sun softly peered through the lace curtains of Ivy Hollow's parish hall, casting doiled shadows across the polished oak floor. According to everyone, it was the epitome of an English afternoon. Sitting modestly by the window, Jane Marple could see the garden path clearly. Her attitude was as gentle as the chamomile she drank, but her eyes sharp, pale blue, and ever observant. From one guest to another, quietly observing everyone. "Delightful turnout, don't you think?" chirped Reverend Finch's wife Agnes, who was occupied with a platter of lemon tarts, from her vantage point at the head of the table. "We've even managed to entice old Mrs. Price out of her nest," she said. The scones were either freshly cooked or had been sitting in the Women's Institute freezer next to them. The argument was being whispered between a retired governess with infamously stiff manners and young Florence Hargrove. Lily, who had recently lost her husband, sipped her tea with the demeanor of someone who has just tasted treachery. The social ballet of the room was familiar, but today there was an unnatural brightness in the voices and glances. There were 2 long silences when laughter should have followed. Take Elsie Crompton, for example. A month ago, she sat nervously on 2 chairs, picking at her cake. Her husband had taken ill in the night and died by morning from natural causes. The doctor said that Elsie's grief had rendered her heart incapable of pumping blood, without any of the hazy heaviness Horace, a local solicitor and relentless gossip, from Lichfield, had arrived late and looked around the room before settling into a chair farthest from Lily. The two had a long-standing feud that began in 1948 over a disputed boundary hedge and a failed romantic overture. But today Horace offered Lily a polite nod and even poured her tea. Florence Harrave's laughter was too loud, so Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, sensing that something was brewing beyond the Darjeeling Agnes. Finch bustled by with a tray of Battenberg, her smile unwavering. "Oh, Jane, you must try one baked, just this morning, miss." Marple accepted the square with a gracious nod, noticing the tremble in Agnes's fingers, nothing overt but enough to signal strain. Tension unspoken and yet shared, these things had a way of blooming in Ivy Hollow, like fungi in shade, silently until too late at the far end of the hall. Mrs. Lavinia Wetherall, newly arrived from London and renting the late Colonel cottage, was holding court among a trio of younger women. She was charming, that much was certain, always dressed in flowing silks. A little too bright for the countryside, and forever ready with an anecdote from her theatre days, though no one had ever confirmed she'd performed on any actual stage. Her presence had, in a matter of weeks, created its own gravitational pull in the village miss. Marple sipped again. Lavinia Wetherall was watching someone, not glancing, but watching, subtle, deliberate. Her eyes moved only when Florence stood to fetch more tea, trailing her lace hem dangerously near. A candle Lavinia's gaze didn't follow. Florence, it shifted slightly right. Toward Elsie. Jane. Agnes leaned in with an apologetic wheeze. "Forgive me, but would you be a dear and look in on Mrs. Price this Thursday? She's been difficult, keeps talking of noises in the night and some nonsense about someone tampering with her bed linens. Poor woman's mind is fraying, of course, even though Miss responded kindly. I've seen that people we assume are forgetful actually remember the most crucial details." Alessandro blinked at the artificial grin and slipped away from the table. Horace Lichfield had launched into a story about a foreign aristocrat and a forged will. The ladies tittered obligingly, but Miss Marple noticed Lavinia Wetherall was no longer smiling. Her attention had shifted again, this time to her handbag, which she pressed tighter under her arm. The sun began to fade, and the tea Things were cleared slowly, guests made their farewells, laughter, kisses on cheeks, small gossip promises. To follow up by post, Miss Marple waited until the hall had nearly emptied before rising. As she stepped outside, a sudden breeze rustled the hedges behind her. Lavinia Wetherall lingered by the door, her scarf fluttered briefly, revealing the delicate chain round her neck. Miss Marple's eyes caught the pendant, an oddly shaped locket, dark metal, tarnished, almost like put. Odd taste for you haven't had my lemon cordial yet. Lavinia called gently. Tomorrow I'll bring you a bottle. It would be wonderful. I prefer to prepare my own beverages, if you don't mind, Miss Marple replied in a kind voice. Lavinia inclined her head, but it was clearly understood. Miss Marple grinned, but her thoughts were already consumed by Elsie Crompton. Lily's silence, the pewter locket, Agnes's trembling hands, and Mrs. Price's disturbed sleep. Tomorrow she would accept the cordial, but she would not drink it. On Wednesday morning, the piece of Ivy Hollow had returned to the surface. Outside the bakery, children played hopscotch. The postman whistled an old war tune, and the aroma of bread wafted warmly from Mrs. Penrose's ovens. However, those who had attended the Tuesday fellowship tea sensed a weight in the air, not storm clouds, but more like a collective sensation that something had been noticed, though no one dared to say what, at the vicarage. Agnes Finch poured Hires into a chipped ceramic jug, her hands unusually still. She still hadn't told Reverend Finch about the strange feeling that had lingered after the gathering. The impression that someone had been acting. Lavinia Wetherall stood motionless near the door, her gaze fixed on Elsie, and it unsettled Elsie. Elsie Crompton had been nowhere to be seen that morning, with the blinds drawn and the gate locked. A faint aroma of boiled potatoes wafted from her chimney, assuring the milkman that she was alive and cooking at 11:15, as she leisurely strolled along Church Lane. Miss Marple held a tin of oatmeal biscuits and a folded letter in her handbag. Mrs. Price's stone cottage was her destination. She politely knocked once, but the door creaked open a full minute later. "You're late," Mrs. Price grumbled. Her eyes narrowed. "I'm right on time," Miss Marple replied cheerfully, "though I suspect your clock has always been 5 minutes fast." Despite the brisk morning air, she seemed unfazed by the wind and continued on her way. The cottage was warm and packed with framed samplers, upright furniture, a slight scent of lavender polish, and Mrs. Price gave a sniff of hesitant amusement before stepping aside. The faded carpeting beneath the table was pointed out by Miss Marple as perhaps being used to conceal a stain. "Unfortunately, I don't have much to contribute. The tea has gone cold and the scones are 2 days old. I'll gladly accept neither and be satisfied. I brought these biscuits in case you felt like something fresh," Miss Marple replied, placing the tin on the counter. Mrs. Price's lips quivered, and she whispered, "You're kind, Jane, and clever." There was a hush, but it wasn't empty. Someone had been in here. "As far as I can tell, Miss Marple has been tilting her head ever since last night." The elderly woman's eyes flew to the hall, but she didn't do anything. "Curiously, I discovered that the corner of my bedsheet was turned down, and the bottle of lotion was uncapped. If there were any indications of a break, has anyone reported this to anyone? Agnes Finch believes I've lost my mind." Miss Marple smiled softly as she addressed the issue. The windows were secured and the doors bolted, but someone had a key or knows how to acquire one. Mrs. Price's expression became more intense. Miss Marple made a mental note to remind herself that although Agnes means well, she worries too much about appearances. "I've been meaning to reread Northanger Abbey, so maybe your spare bed could host a fellow reader." Mrs. Price hesitated, saying, "I wouldn't want to trouble you." A moment of relief flashed across Mrs. Price's lined face, and I accepted. The elderly governess, Lavinia Wetherall, stood before her vanity mirror, lips pursed. She wore a dark burgundy silk scarf embroidered with small peacocks, and her earrings were pearls, not rhinestones, because governesses of her ilk did not tend to go into fits of hysteria. "I hope I'm not too early," Florence Harrov said, her curls bouncing in the breeze as she entered her cottage. "Perfect timing," Lavinia said with a smooth voice. "I've just steeped the jasmine." Seated in the sunroom, where verdant vines scrambled up the glass walls and the furniture exuded an air of genuine bohemia, they took their seats. Florence casually lifted her cup and said, "Mrs. Penrose says Elsie Crompton hasn't been by since Sunday." Lavinia poured tea and offered Florence a sugar cube. Even while I find it hard to believe that Lavinia and Mr. Crompton ever felt passionately connected, I suppose it's true that sadness can do strange things to individuals. Lavinia refrained from responding directly. Ellie's reserved demeanor is often accompanied by pleasant surprises. "You think she's hiding something?" Claudia asked with an eyebrow arch, as Florence looked down at the strange locket lying on Lavinia's collarbone. Lavinia smiled and remarked, "I think everyone is dear." "It was my mother's." As the sun began to set, the vicarage began to receive suspicious notes. One of these notes came from Mrs. Penrose's sister, who had stopped by for dinner and made the casual comment that Elsie's cat had been yowling on the stoop all day, unfed and unusual. Lavinia, which she had so easily put out of style, comforted me. While settling into Mrs. Price's guest room, Miss Marple tucked Northanger Abbey beside the lamp and pulled the curtains. The house remained unchanged. She had previously committed the layout to memory, which included 3 windows on the left side, 2 doors with old-fashioned bolt locks, a narrow hall that creaked near the coat, and, after setting her purse on the chair, she carefully removed the folded letter inside, which turned out to be an obituary notice from 1934. No one has been found to claim Caroline Gresham as a relative. She was 53 years old and a cherished friend, mother, and actress. Meanwhile, downstairs, Mrs. Price was already sound asleep, and Miss Marple tapped the paper's corner with thoughtfulness. Miss Marple, on the other hand, sat motionless by the window, her gaze fixed on the moonlit garden. Earlier that day, she had noticed a figure lurking behind the hedges, too tall for a village child and too motionless for a passer-by. Instead of waiting for sleep, she instead anticipated movement. Chapter 3. Miss Marple did not sleep as the moonlight drove through ivy. Hollow and mist whispered around her, a fox snaking between hedges at midnight. She sat at the window, needles in hand, listening to the faint toll of the church bell. She pretended to knit a scarf, but in reality, she was just knitting as a rhythmic distraction from her thoughts. At 1 o'clock, the silence was broken with a loud click, but with a subtle metallic shift near the back porch. As Ma waited for morning to break, a pale, feeble sunbeam emerged through the grey sky. Mrs. Price greeted her guest with an apologetic scowl, asking, "Hard mattress, I imagine you didn't sleep a wink." "Oh, I did well enough." Her hands rested on the soft yarn, and her eyes narrowed. Marple had dusted flour along the edge of the threshold before retiring, a faint trick she'd learned in her youth not for baking, but for guarding against burglars. Shortly after tea, Miss Marple declined an offer to stay again, saying with a gentle grin that she had no dreams, little mercy. "Best not wear out my welcome," she remarked, and Mrs. Price secretly grateful for the tranquil restoration of her Routine agreed with a whispered goodnight. Miss Marple returned to her own cottage by 8 and paused just inside her gate, eyeing the small cluster of footprints in the earth. Her own, clearly, the postman's, and a third set boots, smaller than a man's, heavier than a child's. She stepped inside and set the kettle to boil on the table. She laid out the flower-streaked handkerchief she had carefully pressed to the back step before dawn. A smudged impression of a soul marked the center, not deep, no weight behind it, but angled, as if the person had stood for a moment, then turned away. No entry, just watching that afternoon ivory. Hollow buzzed with a kind of nervous energy, not overt. No one spoke of murder or danger, but conversations tilted slightly more sharply. People eyed their neighbors longer than usual at the grocer's. Florence Harvey leaned over the cheese counter voice. "Lo, did you hear Mrs. Price had a visitor last night? Jane Marple, of all people." Mrs. Penrose looked up from the till. "Mrs. Price says someone's been entering her house." Florence's lips twisted. "Wouldn't surprise me if she's just forgetful old minds. Invent all sorts of dramas, except Jane stayed the night," Mrs. Penrose murmured, "and she doesn't entertain nonsense." Florence remained silent as they walked away. Horace Litchfield meticulously sorted apples at exactly 3 o'clock every morning, even though others assumed he wasn't. Then Miss Marple showed up at the Wetherall cottage gate. As Lavinia slipped on her ivory gloves and pressed skirt, she greeted Miss Marple with a "Why, Miss Marple, what a pleasure. I wasn't expecting you." "Oh, I see," Miss Marple said, "but I've brought something that I believe might pique your interest." Lavinia carefully removed the obituary clipping from her purse. Her countenance was unreadable as she read it word by word. "Caroline Gresham," she said. "I haven't heard that name in years." "Oh," Miss Marple tilted her head. "You did know her then?" "One of my mother's cousins." She, Lavinia, spoke with great care, eccentric, gifted, and, in her latter years, rather reclusive actress. "Oh, I found it while going through some old church attic pamphlets." Her name seemed familiar. Lavinia, who, I believe, toured much in the 1920s, folded the piece and placed it on the hallway table. "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's voice was light, innocent. Lavinia offered tea. Miss Marple declined. Before departing, she paused by the mantel. "Lovely locket you wore yesterday, Pewter, I think." Lavinia's smile didn't falter. It was Caroline's, actually. "Bit old-fashioned, I admit." "Oh, not at all, Miss Marple," replied Pewter's. "A curious choice, though. Did you know it was often used in older snuff boxes? Lends itself to absorbing scents. Quite a porous metal, really." Lavinia said nothing. Her hand grazed the pendant absently. Miss Marple left with a pleasant farewell and a certainty forming at the edge of her thoughts. Later that evening, Miss Marple attended a committee meeting at the parish hall regarding the upcoming spring fete. It was a routine affair, bunting colours, trickle tart competitions, but tonight the atmosphere was freer. Finch was distracted, fumbling her notes. Lily, usually contemptuous, offered a rare quiet, but Horace Litchfield was looking great, as usual, smirking, providing unsolicited advice, and looking across at Florence all the time. As the meeting came to a close, attendees dispersed hastily outdoors, leaving Miss Marple to sit serenely with her fingers crossed over her lap and an anxious eye on Florence, whose fragile smile betrayed her frequent checks of the time. Miss Marple caught up to Horace. "Mr. Litchfield," she added with a smile, "I was wondering if you could lend me a hand. You know so much about property, boundaries and such." He thought, "Well, I do try to stay informed. House of Colonel Harrington in Lavinia's property. There is a cellar that has been neglected for years. The low ceiling and stone floor make it seem like it floods, which is quite unpleasant. Rumor has it that Harrington hid all sorts of strange stuff down there, including a gun and letters with war secrets. What are captivating it was not the same thing that happened that night at her own table with Mr. Litchfield. Miss Marple responded. And what about the key that was either lost or hidden? Her eyes narrowed slightly. As she looked over her notes, Miss Marple poured herself a little cherry drink and thought about how lockets old, maybe hollow, accumulates traces. Caroline Gresham has not yet listed her family. Lavinia has claimed a connection to the light-tread feminine boots that Mrs. Price wore, which are the same size as her shoes. The discovery of Mrs. Price's obituary in the church attic is highly unlikely to have been a coincidence. Mrs. Price has claimed that her sheets were disturbed, her liniment uncapped, and that she was searching for something or planting something. She tapped her pen against the paper, stating that there had been no theft or violence, but that there had been an intentional presence. As she listened outside, she heard a faint knock at her front door, which she didn't rise to check. By Friday morning, Ivy Hollow had already made up its collective mind, though not officially. No accusations were spoken aloud, at least not in a way that could have reached the wrong ears. Eleanor Crompton, she was the last to depart from the fellowship, and now that her husband had died unexpectedly and peacefully, the widow had drawn the curtains and left the cat yowling on the doorstep. In Ivy Hollow, a moment of quiet might convey a great deal. Didn't she appear agitated? "I'm not usually one to spread rumours," mumbled Mrs. Penrose as she passed a piece of Dundee cake to Agnes Finch at the church luncheon, "but they say she has refused visits from even her sister in Norwich, and hasn't spoken to anyone since Sunday." "Possibly in mourning or hiding," Agnes scowled. With a lowered voice, Mrs. Penrose added. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable as she slowly stirred her tea. Elsie Crompton had spoken to her once since the tea, a brief conversation across the gate, in which Elsie thanked her for the biscuits and awkwardly mentioned that she wouldn't be attending Sunday's service. Rumour has it that she used to keep sleeping draughts for her husband, but there's no evidence of that. She hadn't been grieving. Her tone had been stiff and practiced. By midday, Miss Marple had picked up on the fear, and the rumour had spread to Horace Litchfield, who wasted no time spreading it throughout the village with his usual mix of joy and drowsiness. "I won't criticize the woman," he declared in front of the butchers, "but I do wonder how much we truly know about her. She wasn't born here, you know. She moved in after marrying Harold. Harold, bless his heart, wasn't exactly a gregarious. He may have had secrets. The police aren't involved, not yet," he continued after a little pause that allowed his audience to mentally construct those secrets. As the sun set, Florence Harave stood outside the Crompton cottage. She had planned to leave a basket of rolls and elderflower cordial inside as a gesture of goodwill. But now she hesitated. The house was dark inside, with no light coming from the windows or the fire. She cautiously lifted the latch and entered the garden, where the aroma of damp earth and hires lingered on the hedges. "Elsie," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She left the basket by the door, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the linen cloth. Just as she was about to depart, she noticed something off. A faint flicker, not light but a change in the fabric behind the upstairs curtain. Florence froze, and then it disappeared just as suddenly as it had come. Later that night, in Miss Marple's sitting room, she had a visitor, Jane. He started to take the cup of tea that she offered him. "I've found a note that was hidden under the vestry door. I've been reading it, and Miss Marple has been reading it silently. The widow does not want to talk, but there's something under her pillow." The writing isn't signature-worthy, and the ink is slightly smudged from dampness. Do you think it could be a threat? He asked. No, she responded. The lines were once again scanned by Miss Marple's whispered eyes. It's a provocation to do what? To make someone act. With a concerned expression, Agnes Finch knocked on Miss Marple's door the following morning. Elsie's been found. Miss Marple momentarily halted while buttoning her coat, her expression betraying her state of mind. The doctor informed her that she had been taking sleeping pills, possibly in her tea. She speculated that it had been more than a day since she had woken up. When Miss Marple did not answer the door, the doctor summoned assistance. According to the doctor, she might have been attempting to jot down some thoughts before collapsing. A note, however, was found, but it was in a tattered and unreadable. Miss Marple nodded in agreement. The police began questioning her, but she seemed confused, keeping repeating about a small box and silver fingers. Although a look of uncertainty crossed Miss Marple's face, she remained silent as she blinked her silver fingers, indicating that she was insane. Meanwhile, Pewter absorbed everything that Marple said. The following evening, Miss Marple went to supper at the vicarage. The atmosphere was electric, but there was an air of tension because everyone knew that the peace of Ivy Hollow had been officially disturbed not by a body, but by intent. As the evening came to a close, the conversation shifted to plans for spring. Horace, who had been enjoying his own voice, fell silent for a beat. Florence barely glanced up from her plate, and Agnes, who was flustered, spilled gravy on the linen. These were just minor details, but Miss Marple took note of them all, asking softly, "Did Caroline Gresham have children?" Miss Marple probed further. Lavinia seems taken aback. "No, none that I know of." Mrs. Marple sighed and murmured, "Pity." For the most complex legacies are sometimes those that gifted women leave behind. As she sipped her tea, her gaze lingered on the steaming pot. "Not accusing," she said, "just observing." Chapter 5 took place on a windy Saturday morning, and Miss Marple made her usual pilgrimage to the chemist. The doorbell jangled slightly as she stepped inside, and the aroma of soap, chalk, dust, and medicinal bitters wafted over her. Mr. Timothy Delwell, a man who took great delight in his neat shelves and was equally terrified of meaningless small talk, nodded courteously to Miss Marple. She looked over the neatly organized rows of bottles and said, "Something for your arthritis? Maybe just a packet of lavender salts today. Thank you." "I had a question about liniments, though." His eyebrow arched, and he clarified that he meant the warming kind, not the sleeping variety. "I was wondering if Mrs. Price still used the German rub with the almondy scent." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple whispered. "Curious, though I happened to notice her bottle was uncapped the other night." "Not a cent, you miss." Cartwell hesitated, her voice trailing off. "I used to sell a lot of that, but now I think she had her last bottle refilled about 2 months ago." Cartwell appeared perplexed. Maybe she had accidentally left it open, or maybe Miss Marple had agreed, though the aroma I detected wasn't quite almond. It was sharper, fainter, but distinguishable. She paid for her item and paused, her gaze darting to the compact assortment of travel toiletries by the door. There, she beheld a trio of contemporary perfume bottles with floral branding, pink labels, and a new edition labeled Night Bloom. She removed the cap from one of the bottles and inhaled lightly, finding that it was not quite perfume. At noon, the town square was bustling with activity as clouds rolled in, hiding something beneath the rose-bitter almond. It is my sincere wish that the topic of discussion had already changed when the spring fade Committee met again at the War Monument to settle on bunting arrangements. Recovery for Elsie, whispered softly, even though it's strange. Some think Florence Harov penned something before she fainted, so she's fixing her silk gloves. Utter nonsense, Horace Litchfield snorted dismissively. She has never been one to utter a word, and I've never thought of her as having a theatrical personality. Agnes Finch whispered something, but Miss Marple remained silent. She glanced over to see Lavinia Wetherall, who was carefully plucking baby's breath from the florist's cart. Lavinia was wearing a green scarf and applying minimal makeup that day. Miss Marple turned back to ask if anyone else had been sick recently. Florence blinked, but she didn't know why. It made her think about how things usually come in pairs, like how spring. Frost nips rose buds before violets. Is she implying that Elsie was poisoned? Horace stated it with the sincere desire of someone who was hoping against hope that she was. Elsie lay pale but alert beneath stiff white sheets, her eyes widening when Miss Marple entered. The nurse on duty, familiar with Miss Marple's quiet authority, allowed her 10 minutes. Elsie said, "I didn't try to harm myself. I would never. I just wanted to rest. Someone else wanted you unconscious, not dead, at least not yet," Miss Marple said as she settled into the chair next to her. It was the bitterness of the tea that made Elsie's fingers twitch as they slid across the blanket. Elsie nodded slowly. "There was something under my pillow before I fell asleep. I saw a piece of paper, but I couldn't read it. The smell reminded me of old soap, like the kind my aunt used to keep in the linen drawers." Miss Marple asked if anyone had visited that night. Elsie hesitated, but I think Florence dropped something on the step. "I never saw her face that evening." Miss Marple invited Agnes Finch for tea and scones. As Agnes settled into the armchair, Miss Marple placed a small plate before her and started pouring tea. "Agnes, do you remember the perfume Lavinia wore to the fellowship tea?" Agnes scowled. "It was a strong floral scent, stronger than I liked. I think it was a layered scent." The scent of Lavinia lingered on Mrs. Price's bedsheets, and strangely enough, a very similar trace was noted near Elsie Crompton's pillow. Miss Marple said, "One with a trace of something sharper, something masked." Agnes looked confused, and she asked, "Do you mean it was laced, not the perfume itself?" In a subtle manner, Miss Marple mentioned that whoever was in the vicinity of the two women during the night had an unattractive but practical item on their persona. Perfume called Night Bloom that could only be found in one store. The chemist's travel displayed was bought just last week, according to Mr. Cartwell's ledger. Agnes's eyes widened as Miss Marple smiled knowingly. After morning service, the village of Ivy Hollow seemed like a powder keg with its fuse quietly smouldering. The usual rhythms persisted, such as the chime of the chapel bell, the shuffle of books, and the scent of scones at tea. However, something taut hung behind every smile. That night, Miss Marple sat in her drawing room, cross-stitching by the light of the lamp. She had almost everything she needed. As people leaned forward in their seats, they could feel a subtle tension that didn't quite reach a sigh. As usual, Miss Marple attended the service with her handbook and gloves neatly folded in the other. She couldn't help but notice various details, such as Lavinia Wetherall's length of time outside the nave before entering, Florence Harov's complete absence, and Horace Litchfield's incessant glances toward the Finch pew, where Agnes sat rigidly, seemingly avoiding her husband. Afterwards, the conversation outside the church became awkward and knotted, which was unfortunate because Elsie Vu murmured. Lily remained cloaked in her mink stole as the temperature rose. Yet, I must admit that she always appeared undernourished. It was as if she had been under the influence of drugs. Agnes remarked firmly, getting a glance from the lady really. Agnes, must we be so morbid? It's not morbid, it's reality. She was targeted. Horace stepped into the circle, arching a brow. Let's not leap to conspiracies. Perhaps she took something by mistake. She's not the only one who's been visited. Surely you don't think there's a prowler in the village? Miss Marple asked softly, as all eyes were drawn to Mrs. Price, who had mysteriously disappeared from church. Speculation had circulated that she had hired the village locksmith to change every lock in her home. Mrs. Price had been cagey about her recent scare, sharing only with one neighbor the intriguing detail that she now sleeps with a poker under her pillow. Trallion inquired, I think there's something or someone moving through the village under the pretense of friendship. Lavinia returned Miss Marple's gaze with a subtle smile, and later that afternoon there was a slight ruckus at the vicarage, unannounced. Florence Hargrove showed there with heated cheeks and watery eyes. I need to speak to you, she said to Agnes, ignoring Reverend Finch entirely. They went into the study and closed the door 30 minutes. Past when Florence emerged, her composure was brittle. At best, I was worried that Miss Marple, who was sitting nearby with a mug of tea and the Essex County Gazette, may misinterpret Florence's hurried farewell. Miss Marple poured Agnes a new cup as she re-entered the room, pale and tight-lipped. Well then, Agnes said, trying to maintain a steady voice. It seems Florence has had relations with Mr. Crompton for years. Agnes stiffened, admitting that she had ended the relationship months before he died, but that she was afraid Elsie might have known. With a cordial nod, Miss Marple said, No, just rolls. Even still, the inference was sufficient, and Agnes lowered her gaze to her cup. Carissa's not evil, Jane, just foolish. She didn't want Elsie to suffer and thought she could tidy it away. Miss Marple folded her hands. Guilt has its own flavour. Agnes sometimes bitter enough to taste like poison that evening in the dim light of the village's only pub. Horace Litchfield held court over a half-pint of bitter and an audience of two, an out-of-work actor from the next town over, and Lavinia Wetherall, who sipped ginger ale and listened to Quietly, You Know. Horace was saying when Harold Crompton died, the whole estate passed to Elsie. Small fortune, actually invested in some railway shares from before the war. Lavinia looked up. Really, I hadn't heard. Oh yes, which makes one wonder if Elsie were to fall ill or worse, who might benefit? He didn't mention names, but his eyes flicked toward Lavinia. She smiled pleasantly. I wouldn't know, I barely knew the woman. Sometimes that's just the right amount to know, he remarked, his grin becoming wider as he spoke. Miss Marple, he whispered, her identity concealed in her knitting bag, a name of a railway firm stashed away, while a gentle rain pattered against the windows that night. Horace had recently descended, and he was irresponsible with details. Men are notorious for boasting and revealing more than they intended to. I wasn't expecting callers, so I won't be long, Miss Marple added gently, but I think you ought to know something. This was her last stop at Lily's house, which was dark, save for the one lamp in the drawing room. She stepped inside, noting the absence of staff. Lily's maid had gone home for the weekend. I have reason to believe the visits to Elsie and Mrs. Price were not isolated incidents. I think someone has been attempting to locate something. Lily's brow furrowed. Locate what? A letter, or perhaps a keepsake, something written, a confession or threat maybe. Lily turned toward the mantel, adjusting a photograph. Jane, I appreciate your good intentions, but I've kept enough secrets for a lifetime. Once you find out, you'll know why I'm here. You didn't report it, my dear, Miss Marple said in a soothing voice. You had a visitor 2 nights ago. The train slowed down as the driver pondered. How on earth did you manage to lock your drawing room window at exactly 9 every evening without a hitch? The latch was always jiggling, your curtains drooped unevenly the next morning, and your cat spent the entire day skulking beneath the shades. I didn't see a face, Lily confessed, just a shape. I thought perhaps it was a dream or indigestion, but it was real. The pause continued. What are they searching for? Lily asked, as she sank into the armchair. Miss Marple whispered, I suspect, in their search for a recollection, Miss Wetherall was assaulted, not murdered, but shaken, dishevelled, and certain. She claimed that someone had broken in during the night and rifled through her belongings. By 8 o'clock the following morning, the postman had discovered the door ajar. By 9 o'clock, the constable had arrived, and by 10 o'clock, whispers had reached every corner of the village. Miss Marple arrived just before 11 o'clock, summoned not by the police, but by Agnes Finch, who had hurried to the scene with a new shawl and a teapot, as if the shock could be soothed with chamomile. Lavinia sat in her sunroom, pale-faced and holding a throw over her shoulders. The room had been violently disturbed, with books scattered across the floor and drawers open. Her hands trembled as she took a cup of tea. I didn't hear them, she whispered. Only saw what they'd done this morning, my papers, my photographs, all tossed like rubbish. While Miss Marple's eyes darted about the room, she seemed to detect Lavinia's hesitation. It's sentimental. Of course, she said, but my Lockither pedestal, one is missing. Miss Marple said gently, and the desk drawer, it was locked. Lavinia nodded. Always I've been cautious lately, after the stories about Mrs. Price and poor Elsie. But whoever did this, they forced it open. Agnes leaned in. Are you sure you didn't just misplace it, dear? No. Lavinia snapped, then immediately softened. I'm sorry, I know what I'm saying sounds dramatic, but it was there, and now it's not. There was no forced entry at Mrs. Price's cottage, but Miss Marple stared at the carpet for an awkwardly long time. Outside, Constable Daniels stood by the garden path, conversing with Horace Litchfield, who had been walking past the cottage on his morning constitutional when the alarm went off. Horace whispered something so low that anyone in the vicinity could hear. A woman targeted in her own home. It could be any of us next. Even though Lavinia has very little worth, Miss Marple approached him, smiling slightly. Horace opened his eyes wide in confusion. No silver, no heirlooms, he said. A thief's haul isn't exactly a treasure trove of books, clothing, and memories, but maybe they were after something specific. Horace grumbled about papers. Maybe the thief wasn't interested in the contents of the drawer, but rather the symbolism of the object itself. Later that day, Florence Harave made a triumphant return, knocking on Miss Marple's door. She was pale and red-eyed, and she whispered, I need to talk to someone. They sat silently by the fire, with the teapot sitting between them, and it wasn't just Harold Crumpton who was involved. Florence admitted that there had been another individual prior to him. Go on, darling. Lavinia, years ago we met in London. I didn't recognize her at first when she came to the hamlet, but then her voice, the way she spoke about the theatre, it clicked. And what connected you? Florence was uncertain. She was involved with someone I cared about, a man named Henry Blake. He was married. And Lavinia, well, she wasn't shy about it. She wrote him letters, long ones, manipulative. I found one once and I tore it in half. Miss Marple looked up from her teacup. And where did you leave it? Hidden in a book. I was too afraid to confront her. I never told. Henry, I burned the letter eventually, or thought I did, but now with everything that's happening, I wonder what if never forgot. What if she's looking for something she thinks I still have at the hospital? Florence shook her head in disapproval, but she had written about Marple in a journal years ago. detailing what she had done to Henry. No one should have. Read it, but you would think she knows. Meanwhile, Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. Elsie Crompton grew stronger that afternoon. She sat up in bed and demanded to speak with Miss Marple. Lavinia. She's lying, Elsie said firmly. The night I fell ill, she came to my house. What did she say? She brought me a scarf, which she called a peace offering. She apologized if she had upset me over the tea, but I didn't understand what she meant. I drank very little of the tea she brought, and I remained confused for hours. Elsie nodded at my pillow. Underneath it, I found a scrap of paper that smelled faintly of metal and perfume, but I couldn't read it. Miss Marple's grip on her notebook grew tighter as she searched through it. Elsie appeared perplexed, but I recalled finding a small photograph of a smiling, dark-haired woman in Harold's desk. I burned the photo and kept it to myself. Did she know about it? I think she suspected. A few months ago, she asked me if Harold had ever mentioned his time in Portsmouth. I told her no. After that evening, as dusk painted Ivy Hollow in grey and gold, she became silent. As Miss Marple knitted in her study, the pattern gradually took shape with each visit from Mrs. Price. Elsie is currently Lavinia-centered, not around valuables, but memory letters, notes, scars on paper. It seemed like someone was trying to erase or avoid the past. But the assault on Lavinia changed everything. Before, everything had been chaotic and open, like a staged burglary or a warning. Monday arrived, shrouded in a low-lying fog that swallowed sound and blurred edges. Ivy Hollow appeared softer beneath the fog, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. Lavendia had claimed her locket was in the writing desk drawer, but 2 nights ago she had been wearing it at the pub. People lie about stolen possessions, but only if they never truly belong to someone. Around 11 o'clock, the village descended into an eerie stillness, as if a room were about to be filled with the sound of someone uttering an unspeakable word. Miss Marple made her way to the parish hall. The scene was innocent enough, a planned meeting on garden club entries for the destiny, but she had that the space be opened. Early, merely a brief gathering, she told Agnes Finch to organize a few flower displays, nothing formal, yet everyone had come. Florence was the first to arrive, her pale fingers concealed in lace gloves. Agnes, toting a tin of shortbread, came next. Lily, distant and tight-mouthed, was followed by Horace Litchfield, who swung in with an affected cough. Reverend Finch, dressed in muted brown and without jewellery, arrived a bit later. Miss Marple, with her practised ease, welcomed everyone. She circulated paper slips, purportedly for voting on flower categories, and offered tea. "I do appreciate your time," she said sweetly, "but I must confess, this little meeting has a secondary purpose." Miss Marple shifted her chairs and said, "I've received word that certain items, personal ones, have been removed from homes in the village. Some have returned, others have not. I believe it's time we address the matter directly." The air tightened, no one moved. Florence cleared her throat. "Are you insinuating stealing?" "No, at least not in the conventional sense." Hoosh sneered at the suggestion that someone is breaking into homes to steal old love letters, but Miss Marple responded that it could be the retrieval of something someone felt unsafe to leave behind. Lavinia's eyes narrowed as she tried to reduce the possibilities. With a smile, Miss Marple turned to him. "It's amazing how far people will go to hide evidence of the past, especially if it could harm them." Jane asked if anyone was being accused of anything, and Miss Marple gently interrupted, saying that we are all here affected by this mystery. Not everyone has been affected equally, of course, but the web is visible. She slowly stood up and walked over to the table where she had placed the slips of paper. Each of you has known at least one of these. Arthur Crompton, Henry Blake, or Caroline Gresham. 3 distinct individuals, a total of 3 levels. A reality. Lavinia's expression turned immobile. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle as she continued. I don't think the trouble began with Harold's death, but with a photograph that a wife found and burned in silence. Someone remembered it, and someone feared what else might surface. With that, she turned to Florence, who had written about Lavinia in a private note long before. Harold died, a note that wasn't a secret to anyone, and whose face had begun to fade from color. I never meant to hurt anyone, she said, but you hurt someone all the same, and secrets like that don't stay buried. Pivoting towards Horace and you, Mr. Litfield, Lavinia finally spoke up, saying, That's all nonsense. No one has those letters. I never even met Henry Blake. Horace blinked. He didn't think it relevant, but you knew where the previous owner kept things, like the deed to the property and an old chest of personal letters. Colonel Harrington's estate was under your care. In the absence of a response, Miss Marple went back to her seat, sipped her tea, and patiently waited for something to happen. Suddenly, a teacup snapped in Florence's fingers. Her grip was to tighten, the handle cracked cleanly. In a whisper, she apologized, and Miss Marple reassured her, saying, It's quite all right. These things happen when one's nerves are worn. She then turned to the others, explaining that she had left an envelope by the window earlier that day. Everyone had noticed. Miss Marple persisted in her investigation into whether or not anyone would be interested in opening an unlabeled, unclaimed white mail. In her state of sheer interest, she observed the room intently. However, no one budged. Lavinia, on the other hand, clenched her teeth, twisted her foot once beneath the chair, and inhaled a coolly questioned, What are you playing at? The only game Miss Marple played was an honest one. After standing up for what seemed like an absurd reason, Lavinia made her way to the window, grabbed the envelope, and proceeded to open it with the same impatient pressure that Miss Marple had observed in her. The night she had asserted that her drawer had been forced open. However, inside, the envelope contained nothing more than a piece of blank parchment, and Lavinia's hand quivered in fear. It was the reaction, my darling, not the letter, but Miss Marple's standing that mattered to everyone. Miss Marple stepped closer. You've been looking for something that might destroy you, visiting homes in the dark, drugging tea, staging your own break-in, but in truth you were only chasing ghosts once. You helped create. Lavinia's hand dropped to her side. The envelope fluttered to the floor. Florence stared. What is she talking about? She was never after a specific object. Miss Marple said gently she feared anything might be out there, a forgotten note, a mislaid photograph, a word spoken in passing. Her secrets were too many to keep track of, and when fear rules a person, they become reckless. Lavinia backed toward the door. I did nothing, Miss Marple followed with measured steps. But you did not, just to Elsie or to Mrs. Price, but long before that, with Henry Blake, with Harold Crompton, with everyone who trusted you. Lavinia turned the doorknob, but Constable Daniels stood waiting on the other side. Chapter 9. The door to the parish hall clicked shut behind Constable Daniels. Lavinia Wetherall stood motionless, framed by the wide windows and one morning light. No one spoke, not Florence, not Agnes, not Horace Litchfield, who had retreated to a corner like a child caught peering through the wrong keyhole. Lavinia remained silent, her hands quivering, despite her usual composure, as Miss Marple silently stated that there was no need to use handcuffs and that no formal charges had been filed. However, she did believe that the truth ought to be spoken before it withered away. Miss Marple turned to face the rest of the party. Let me start at the finish and work my way backwards. 3 women, Lee Crompton, Mrs. Price, and Lavinia herself, were visited that night. 2 of them were left unsettled, 1 was drugged, and 1, of course, planned her own entrance. Miss Marple responded calmly, "Yes." Lavinia faked it, and Florence gasped. Lavinia's lips parted as Miss Marple composedly cut off her denial. She was afraid the village was closing in on her because someone had her past. To avoid having her motivations questioned, she needed to appear vulnerable. She turned to Agnes, and Mrs. Price noticed a faint, bitter almond scent in her bedroom. It wasn't the old liniment, but rather the remnants of the night bloom perfume. Not well liked by the village women, the Lavinia you bought last week has a distinct aroma if you can get beyond the flowers. Thankfully, Mrs. Price's keen memory alerted her to the fact that something seemed amiss when Lavinia left it behind while she searched. Grief makes a person vulnerable, and although Florence next Ellie Crompton had no enemies and no obligations, she did have grief. You mentioned to me that you had a grudge against Lavinia in the past. I think your suspicions made it hard for you to remember the night you left the basket at Elsie's door. Additionally, I think you failed to notice the person trailing behind you. Florence, her cheeks turning red. Lavinia visited Elsie in an apparent effort to make amends. Armed with a new blend of tea, she pleaded with Elsie to get some sleep so she could discreetly search the home for the missing Reverend Finch. Miss Marple gave a small sigh for proof, a letter, a photograph, perhaps a page from a journal, anything that connected Lavinia to Harold Crompton, who unbeknownst to most had once been entangled with her long before he married Elsie. Lily stirred. "You're certain of that?" "I am, because Lavinia let it slip at the fellowship tea when she asked whether Harold had ever mentioned his time in Portsmouth." She turned to Horace next. "And Mr. Litchfield, you confirmed the Crompton estate included a tidy sum money that would go to Elsie alone. Lavinia would get nothing unless she could prove a legal attachment. A marriage, a prior will, a shared investment. I think she hoped to find some link, perhaps one Harold had hidden or destroyed." Horace cleared his throat but said nothing. Missing, Marple continued. "She found nothing at Elsie's, nothing at Mrs. Price's either, but then she remembered Florence, the one woman who had known her under a different name, who might have written something years ago, even by accident, and that, I believe, was when Lavinia decided to act." Florence looked stricken. "The journal, she never found it." Lavinia attempted again, this time with spectacle rather than stealth, staging a break-in at her own home to muddy the timeline. She hoped that if anything surfaced later, she could cry victim first and confuse the narrative. Miss Marple assured her that she likely burned or misplaced it long ago, but Lavinia was unaware of this. Lavinia asserted that the computer locket had been taken because it had absorbed the scent of the same sleeping compound used on Elsie. Miss Marple stood tall and non-threatening, but the room seemed to be skewed in her favor. "You can't prove any of this," Lavinia said with a cracked voice. "The way someone reacts to a blank envelope, lying about when they last wore jewelry, forgetting they claimed something was locked when others saw them open it freely the day before. And then there's the matter of Caroline Gresham." "No," Miss Marple admitted, "not in the way courts like. But proof is not always ink on paper." Lavinia took a deep breath as Miss Marple gently explained that you are not her cousin, but her daughter. The similarities are obvious to anyone who has seen a photo of Caroline, who died at a young age and in a secluded place without any children listed, but she did have one. As she made her way to the table, she pondered the possibility that some of her actions may have been motivated by the pain of being forgotten and erased. "But it doesn't excuse what you did to Elsie." Mrs. Price, or the others you manipulated to keep your lies intact? After a minute of silence, Lavinia broke the silence. Harold had promised to leave her, and her voice was low and flat, but he never kept his word. I had come here, thinking I could get back what was rightfully mine, a name, a place to Instead, she stood there, her emotions completely sapped. Miss Marple nodded once, as if to herself, but the truth was rarely satisfying. But it was a whole chapter. The talk subsided into whispers after 11.5 days, and the rhythms of the town resumed, but with a noticeable limp. Church bells and milk deliveries persisted in Ivy Hollow, but something had changed beneath the surface, and nobody could quite put their finger on it. Lavinia Wetherall had not been seen since Monday's gathering at the parish hall, according to Constable Daniels. She had quietly packed 2 suitcases, boarded a train at Gresham Holt, and disappeared into London's early morning fog. No charges had been filed, no trial awaited. Miss Marple had insisted on it. For now she's a liar, Horace Litchfield had hissed, scandalized. She broke into homes, drugged a woman, falsified a crime, and yet Miss Marple had replied calmly what she truly sought was already lost. She did not commit murder. She tried foolishly to rewrite history and failed for the village. That was harder to accept than any conviction. They wanted someone to pay, they wanted someone to blame, and when the villain vanished without a formal reckoning, that desire turned inward. Mrs. Price returned to her routines with visible unease. Triple-checking her locks, declining all social invitations, she said, "I was making it up," she muttered one afternoon to Miss Marple, sipping weak tea, "that I was senile, but I knew someone had been in my house." "You were right. You were brave enough to say it," Miss Marple murmured gently. In response, Mrs. Price grunted. She no longer felt courageous. She now felt hollow. Florence Harave had also withdrawn, not out of embarrassment, but introspective contemplation. She stopped loitering outside the bakery and stopped showing up early to meetings. Instead, she would arrive late, sit in the back, and listen attentively. One afternoon, as Miss Marple walked past her on the green, she paused, and Claudia smiled slightly. "I used to believe that secrets safeguarded people, but now I understand that they just delay harm." Miss Marple acknowledged the harsh nature of delay. "Do you believe Lavinia ever intended to harm me?" "No." Florence hesitated. Marple remarked, "But she needed you to doubt your memories. That was enough." In a stealthy manner, Florence, who was on the verge of succeeding, and Agnes Finch revised the Spring Fete program, relocating the flower showcase and merging it with the church's bake sale. As Anger told her husband one night, "There's no use in acting like nothing has changed, but maybe things might still be nice." Despite being a man of God and principle, the Reverend could only nod in agreement as he felt uneasy about the impending arrival of deceit at their door. Lily, for her part, never spoke of Lavinia again. When asked about her opinion of the actress woman, she waved her gloved hand as if brushing away an unwanted draft. She was always a woman of affectation, the kind who confuses mystery for elegance. But Miss Marple had seen her expression at the parish hall, had seen the faint pinch in her mouth when Lavinia's name was spoken, had seen her gloved hands tightening as the envelope fluttered from Lavinia's grasp. Lily had once known Caroline Gresham, that much was clear now, and whether she saw Lavinia as a daughter or a ghost, she would never say some things in Ivy Hollow were left buried in soil too shallow to forget. Elsie Crompton recovered slowly. Physically, she regained her strength within a week, but trust, once fractured, took far longer to mend. She kept her blinds open, now let the cat wander freely again, and when Miss Marple visited with a tin of fresh lemon biscuits, Elsie greeted her not with fear, but weariness. "I still don't understand why she came after me," she said quietly. "I never harmed her." You didn't, Miss Marple responded, but Harold was not intentionally nasty. Rather, he was charming and made promises that he had no intention of keeping while Elsie sipped her tea. Harold never told me anything about Elsie, adding, "No, but he may have told himself she didn't matter." Elsie sighed and scowled, saying, "Typical." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You're stronger than you think, Elsie. Maybe, or maybe. I'm just tired of pretending everything's fine." That, Miss Marple said, might be the beginning of peace, the village fate. Arrived on schedule the following Saturday, bunting was strung between the oaks on the green. Children ran in mismatched socks. The jam competition ended in a scandal of its own when Mrs. Penrose accused a rival of using store-bought pectin. Miss Marple sat near the lily competition, thimble on her finger, an embroidery in her lap. She smiled and nodded and watched the dull villagers move around her like shadows, becoming solid again, not whole but stitched back together. Agnes Finch joined her with a sigh. "Do you ever grow tired of being right? Agnes is the place where the lesson takes a break. But I never get tired of trying to figure out why people make mistakes." Jane and Miss Marple occasionally peered at the blossoms. "Lavinia is unlikely to return, as asked by our gazette. But someone with her personality might." Softly, Miss Marple whispered, "Always." On Monday, as Ivy Hollow was starting to tuck the events of the previous 2 weeks into its collection of long-forgotten rumors, a letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. The handwriting on the envelope was meticulous, almost unnaturally neat, but slightly crooked, as if the writer had tried to steady an unsteady hand. Miss Marple read the name in the top corner of the folded letter twice before opening it. Gideon. More oft, it said a name she hadn't expected, a name from Lavinia. Wetherall's old life. The letter was short, matter-of-fact, but its implications unraveled slowly as she read to Miss Jane Marple. "I've recently come into possession of a small box of personal effects belonging to the late Caroline Gresham. The papers were left in trust with my aunt, who oversaw the property where Caroline spent her last years. Included in the papers is a handwritten note that is undated and unsigned, but clearly narrated by Caroline. In it, she mentions a daughter named Lavinia, but does not provide a surname. The note also mentions that the child's father vanished when the funds ran out. I have reason to believe that you might be able to decipher its weight in grams." The second sheet was a transcript, not the original, but close enough. "Lavinia is crying more. I think she's starting to understand that words don't always mean what they seem." Miss Marple carefully folded the paper and set it down next to her tea. The room was silent, except for Caroline's words, which did not offer guilt but gave Lavinia a way to track her desperation. As Miss Marple reclined in her chair, she rarely needed proof to satisfy herself. The town needed something concrete to help them reconcile with the happenings, so she put the letter in an envelope and headed to Vicarage, where she lived in a world of inconsistencies, contradictions, shifts in tone and quiet. Finch read. At first, her eyes searching slowly, mouth pushed into a line. She was her daughter. She said quietly, she wasn't lying about that part. "No," Miss Marple said, "but I can tell you about everything else." A moment of calm followed, as they both felt the crushing weight of the confirmation, which was more disheartening than reassuring. Afterwards, Elsie and Florence were discreetly informed, as was Agnes. Yes, Miss Marple and the village both nodded in agreement. The information was revealed gradually, not in headlines, but through conversation and memory. With a gentle tap on the folded note, she helped them believe what they should have known all along. That afternoon, Florence Hargrove met Miss Marple in the garden behind the rectory, under the shade of a flowering hawthorn. After reading the transcript, she remained silent for a while, and she began to believe she was owed something. Claire looked up, and Miss Marple responded, "But not by you, not by Harold, not by a man long gone and a mother too broken to give her anything more than bitterness and a borrowed name. Does it make her acts forgivable? No, but it does make them understandable." Harold retained the photograph of Lavinia, the other one he found, and a moment later, Florence's voice became more gentle. Miss Marple nodded in agreement. Maybe it was a sign of guilt or weakness, and the note under Elsie's pillow was just a ploy. Lavinia may have meant to leave something suggestive there, but Elsie never caught a glimpse of it. Maybe Lavinia was too scared to retrieve it, or maybe there was nothing there at all. Florence let out a breath, thinking it would make everything feel better, but it never did. As Miss Marple said, "Truth is like sediment. We only notice it when the waves settle elsewhere." The vice president slid the letter across the table with an arched eyebrow, and Horace Litchfield got a copy. "That should put your doubts to rest," Reverend Finch stated in an even tone. Horace glanced over it, scoffed, and remained silent. "No apology, just a quiet lady," he murmured. Trallian's maid intercepted the envelope before she could. When the lady finally read it alone, behind her locked sitting-room door, she poured herself a measure of brandy, though the hour was still early, and stared at the fireplace for an entire afternoon. She'd known Caroline, known the child had once briefly considered taking the girl in herself, but reputations were fragile things, and reputations, she had decided, were not to be shared by Thursday. The village had quieted again. The fate had concluded. The bunting had been folded. The jam scandal had at last replaced the topic of Lavinia Wetherall's departure at the bakery, but Miss Marple knew that the real shift had already taken place. It was in the way Mrs. Price now looked. People in the eye again, in how Agnes Finch no longer defended Florence with deflection, but with warmth, in how Reverend Finch began his next sermon, not with scripture, but with a story about a woman who feared what others knew about her more than what she knew about herself. Ivy Hollow had not forgiven, but it had accepted that evening. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk and recorded the final details in her small, leather-bound journal case. The poison under her pillow, resolution, psychological manipulation with the goal of causing harm, using informal social and emotional data to identify patterns in behavior, and being motivated by a sense of justice. Subtle imprint of terror-proof came late, as it often does, but it was important. She gently snapped the notebook shut and put it back on the shelf. Then she poured herself a little elderflower cordial and waited for the sun to drop. Not to keep an eye out for danger, but to temporarily appreciate its absence. Chapter 12. Stores reopened with their usual hours. The garden club started their pruning competitions by the time June moved into Ivy Hollow. The incident and business with Miss Wetherall had faded just enough to be incorporated into the rhythm of everyday life. The children played hopscotch again along the vicarage wall as if nothing had changed. However, for those who had peeked behind the curtains and felt the chill of fear, something had changed. Miss Marple noticed it in the tiniest details, like how Mrs. Price now locks her garden gate even when it's daylight. Horace Litchfield would look over his shoulder in the square, not out of fear but caution, as if reminded of the limits of gossip's protection. The village hadn't hardened, but had aged slightly, imperceptibly but unmistakably. On the second Sunday of the month, Miss Marple skipped her usual spot at the Finch luncheon, and instead strolled slowly to the edge of the village, where as she paused at the stile, she could smell sweet hay and lavender wafting through the air. Ivy Hollow shimmered in the mid-morning sun, and the church spire glistened with the gentle glow of smoke curling peacefully from its chimneys. The world seemed perfect again, but people still see crimes as disruptions. "You're looking well," Miss Marple said, passing Elsie a jar of plum preserve. "I'm feeling it," Elsie replied, accepting it with a small smile. "However, I still can't drink chamomile without flinching." Miss Marple had previously told Agnes that revelations, rather than tears, exposed the fabric's fraying spots. That afternoon, she visited Elsie Crompton, a widow who had resumed tending to her garden, though with slower and more deliberate movements. Laughing, Miss Marple said, "A reasonable condition." "I was angry at her," Elsie said after a minute, "but now I just feel tired. Grief is most pronounced when it involves masks." They sat beneath a lilac shrub, the perfume of its blossoms almost intoxicating. Elsie nodded slowly, failing to grasp the meaning of what Miss Marple had said. By the time she figured out what she needed, she had already begun to implement her plan. As she gazed out toward the fence, a part of her always suspected that Harold was hiding something. It's funny how it no longer feels like betrayal, more like an inevitable reality. Miss Marple took a sip of her tea and went to pay her respects at Caroline Gresham's grave. The headstone was simple, with only the name and dates engraved on it. As she arranged the stems of the flowers in a beautiful arrangement, she whispered to herself, "Your daughter was seen, truly seen, if only it were too late." Before leaving, she turned to see a sparrow land on the edge of the grave, tilt its head to look at her, and then flies away into the wind. Agnes Finch dropped by one evening with a tin of shortbread and news from the bishop. Marple smiled faintly, as she had always felt that nature observed what people refused to pinch. Finch wanted to offer a sermon next month on forgiveness in the face of duplicity. Arising at the appropriate moment, Miss Marple arched an eyebrow, and Agnes let out a weary laugh. After a moment of silence, Miss Marple cocked her head and asked, "Do you ever get tired of all this?" After a moment of silence, Agnes asked, "Do you ever grow tired of all this?" Miss Marple tilted her head, implying that the individuals involved are sometimes evil. Despite this, Agnes never scowled, explaining that this is because they remind her on the last page of her casebook. Miss Marple recorded her last note. She said softly that goodness is not a guarantee, but a choice. Even when it's hard, most people choose it. Evil, she said, enters through need, dresses itself in justification, and whispers that the past can be rewritten if no one looks too closely. As she closed the book, the kettle whistled gently outside. The sky was clear again, no fog, and whispers were non-existent. However, Miss Marple knew better than to pretend that this tranquility would persist indefinitely. Somewhere, someone was listening to the same whisper, convincing themselves that they were the exception. When they did, she would be ready,